His name was Thomas, 23 years old, born in a small town in Ohio. He had blue eyes, a gap between his front teeth, and a laugh his mother said could fill a whole room. He had enlisted in the United States Army in 1898 because he believed in something. He believed in his country. He believed that what he was doing mattered. He had no idea, not the faintest idea, that within 2 years, the very country he was fighting for would chain him to a wall in the dark and leave him there until his mind began to crack at the seams. He had no idea that the last thing he would ever see of the mainland, the last real glimpse of American soil before the bay swallowed everything, would be the lights of San Francisco glittering in the fog as a military boat carried him away, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as a prisoner. And the island waiting for him in that fog? They called it Alcatraz. And in the year 1900, Alcatraz was not a prison. It was a trap. It was a machine. And once you went in, you didn't come back the same. Some didn't come back at all. Before we go any further into this story, and trust me, this story goes places that will genuinely leave you unsettled, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back, all the way back to the island that America forgot it had. Most people, when they hear the word Alcatraz, think of Al Capone. They think of gangsters in striped suits, of the 1962 escape, of Clint Eastwood in a movie. They think of a legend, a symbol, something almost romantic in its infamy. But here is the truth that the movies never told you. The truth that gets buried under all that mythology. Before Alcatraz was a federal penitentiary, before it held America's most dangerous criminals, before it became one of the most famous prisons in the history of the world, it was a military prison. And during the early years of the 20th century, during the years surrounding 1900, it was something that defies easy description. It was a place where men were sent not just to be punished, but to be unmade. Where the United States government, quietly and without fanfare, warehoused human beings in conditions that would later make reform advocates physically ill when they learned what had been happening out there in the bay. And the thing that makes it truly devastating, the thing that separates this story from any ordinary tale of institutional cruelty, is that most of the men sent there were not hardened criminals. They were soldiers. They were American soldiers. And what happened to them on that island is a chapter of this country's history that was deliberately, methodically, kept out of the light. To understand why Alcatraz became a death trap in 1900, you have to understand what was happening in America in the years just before. The country was at war, not the Civil War that had ended 3 decades earlier. No, this was the Spanish-American War of 1898, a conflict that launched the United States into a new era of military power and global ambition. When that war ended, America found itself with something it had never quite had before: an empire. Territories overseas. The Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. And with those territories came consequences that nobody in Washington seemed fully prepared for. Thousands of American soldiers had been deployed to the Pacific. Thousands of young men from places like Indiana and Tennessee and Georgia, men who had never traveled beyond their home counties, were suddenly fighting in jungles on the other side of the world. Many of them returned sick. Many of them returned broken. And a significant number of them returned in chains, because in the chaos and moral confusion of that war, men had done things that the army could not overlook. Some had deserted. Some had disobeyed orders. Some had crossed lines that even a wartime military could not ignore. And according to historical records, some had even switched sides, defecting to the Filipino cause, fighting alongside the very people America had gone to war against. When those men were captured, when the war wound down and the accounting began, the United States Army had a problem on its hands. It had hundreds of military prisoners, and it needed somewhere to put them. It needed somewhere remote enough that they couldn't escape, somewhere cold enough that even the thought of running would freeze in a man's chest before he acted on it, somewhere that sent a message, not just to the prisoners, but to every soldier watching, somewhere that said, "This is what happens when you break." Alcatraz was already there, already waiting. And in the spring of 1900, the boats began arriving. The numbers tell a story on their own. In the summer of 1899, before the soldiers from the Philippines began returning, the population of the Alcatraz military prison stood at around 25 men. 25. A small, manageable number. Then the boats came. By April of 1900, historical records show the population had exploded to 441 prisoners. 441 men crammed onto an island that hadn't been built to hold anywhere near that number. Think about what that means in practical terms. The infrastructure, the cells, the food supply, the sanitation, the sleeping arrangements, all of it had been designed for a fraction of that population. And suddenly, within the span of a few months, the army had shoved 16 times as many men onto that island as it had held the year before. The overcrowding alone would have been catastrophic. But overcrowding was only the beginning, because the men who arrived from the Philippines weren't arriving healthy. Historical accounts from the period describe soldiers returning from the tropics carrying diseases that San Francisco's hospitals struggled to contain. Dysentery, malaria, tropical fevers with names that the doctors at Alcatraz had never even studied in medical school. The island's hospital, already a sparse and inadequate facility by any standard of the day, was overwhelmed almost immediately. And men who needed medical care, real, sustained, life-saving medical care, were instead given a cot in an overcrowded ward, or worse, left in the general population to deteriorate in conditions that would only accelerate their decline. Some of them died on that island, not from punishment, not from any act of deliberate cruelty by any single individual. They died because the system they had been fed into was never designed to keep them alive. And nobody in Washington was paying close enough attention to notice. Now let's talk about Thomas. Because Thomas wasn't just a number in a historical archive. He was one of those 441 men who arrived in 1900, and his story, a composite drawn from the real experiences documented by historians and former prisoners of this era, is the story of what Alcatraz actually meant on a human level. Thomas had grown up in a two-room house outside of Zanesville, Ohio. His father worked the fields. His mother took in laundry from the neighbors. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. But they were proud people, and when Thomas enlisted at 19 years old, his father shook his hand at the door and told him to carry himself with honor. Thomas meant to do exactly that. He was shipped to the Philippines in 1899, part of the wave of American soldiers sent to suppress the Filipino independence movement that had flared up in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. What he saw there changed him in ways he didn't have words for. The fighting was brutal in ways that no recruiting poster had prepared him for. The jungle, the heat, the moral confusion of a war where the lines between soldier and civilian, between enemy and innocent, were never clean. Thomas held on. He followed orders. He kept his head down. But in the summer of 1899, something happened. The exact circumstances, lost to history the way so many individual stories are lost, resulted in Thomas being court-martialed. The military process moved swiftly and without mercy. He was convicted. And then he was put on a boat. And then the bay came up around him, and the fog closed in, and the lights of San Francisco disappeared, and the island appeared in the mist ahead of him. And a guard told him to stand up and put his hands out, and the iron closed around his wrists, and that was that. When Thomas and the hundreds of men like him arrived at Alcatraz in 1900, what they found was not a purpose-built modern prison. What they found was an aging military fortress that had been serving as a prison since the Civil War, a facility that was already decades old, already crumbling in places, already struggling to function as anything more than a warehouse for human beings the Army wanted kept away from the rest of the world. The original structure on the island dated back to the 1850s, when the U.S. Army had first fortified Alcatraz as a coastal defense position. A citadel had been built at the top of the island, a three-story barracks surrounded by a deep, dry moat, designed to serve as a last line of military defense. By 1900, that citadel was the heart of the prison operation. And beneath it, beneath the main floor of the building, was the basement, the old kitchen level of the citadel, a place below ground, a place with no natural light, a place where the stone walls wept with moisture from the bay. The inmates called it the dungeons. The guards had other names for it. But whatever you call it, now here is where the story of Alcatraz in 1900 gets truly disturbing. Because the conditions on the island were not the product of any single warden's cruelty. They were not the result of any rogue commander who had gone off the rails. They were the product of policy. Deliberate, institutional, written-down policy. The regulations governing the Alcatraz military prison in the early 1900s were explicit about what a prisoner was, and was not entitled to. A prisoner was entitled to 18 ounces of bread per day in solitary confinement. Water, as much as he desired. That was the entirety of the nutrition provided to a man being held in isolation. 18 ounces of bread and water. To put that in perspective for a moment, the average adult male doing moderate physical labor requires somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day simply to maintain basic body function. 18 ounces of bread provides roughly 1,400 calories under ideal conditions, and the bread at Alcatraz was not made under ideal conditions. Men in solitary confinement were being slowly starved. And this was not abuse. This was the rule. This was written down in the regulations. This was what the United States Army had decided was acceptable. Beyond the food, the regulations dictated that prisoners would be kept at hard labor 6 days a week. Hard labor, not light work, not administrative duties. The kind of labor that broke your body even if you arrived healthy, which, given the diseases many of the soldiers had returned with from the Philippines, a significant number of men had not. They quarried rock. They broke stone. They built the very walls that held them, hauling materials across the island in wind that came off the bay like a blade. And if a man couldn't work, if his body gave out, or the fever took hold, or the isolation had already begun to do what isolation does to the human mind, he went to the hole. He went below, into the dark. The psychological dimension of what Alcatraz did to men in this era is not something that the historical record captures fully, because the men who could have told their stories in full didn't always survive to tell them. And the ones who did survive were often too damaged by what had happened to find coherent language for it. But we know enough. We know enough from the fragments that made it out. We know that the silence rule, the prohibition on communication between prisoners, was in effect at Alcatraz during the military prison era, and that it was enforced with a relentlessness that former inmates described as maddening. You couldn't speak to the man next to you. You couldn't acknowledge him. You could be surrounded by hundreds of other human beings and be as isolated as if you were on the moon, because the institutional apparatus around you was specifically designed to prevent the kind of human connection that keeps people sane. Some men found workarounds. Historical accounts mention prisoners who discovered they could communicate through the plumbing, emptying the water from their toilet bowls and whispering through the pipes. It sounds almost like something from a film, but it happened. Men were so desperate for the sound of another human voice, for any confirmation that they existed and were seen and were not entirely alone, that they were whispering through sewage pipes. That tells you everything you need to know about what the silence was doing to them. And then there was the cold. Anyone who has spent time in San Francisco knows that the Bay has a particular kind of cold. It is not the dry, crisp cold of the mountains. It is a wet, penetrating cold that finds you through layers of clothing, that settles into your joints and your chest and doesn't leave. The temperature of the water surrounding Alcatraz runs at approximately 53 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to incapacitate a swimmer within minutes, cold enough that the Army correctly calculated it as a natural barrier against escape. But the cold didn't stay in the water. The wind off the bay carried it directly into the prison buildings, through the thin walls, under the cell doors, into the stone corridors where men slept on thin mattresses, when mattresses were provided at all. Prisoners who were being punished were sometimes given nothing, a concrete floor and a blanket, if they were fortunate. The cold at night, combined with malnutrition and the damp of the island, created the perfect conditions for the respiratory illnesses that tore through the prison population with devastating regularity. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, conditions that were treatable with rest and proper nutrition, neither of which were available to the men of Alcatraz in 1900 in any meaningful way. Let's talk about what the Army called escape attempts, because they are instructive. In 1900, around the same time the population had swelled with returning Philippine War prisoners, for men attempted something that reads almost as a dark comedy when you learn the details. They built a raft out of a butter vat, an actual butter vat, the kind used in the prison kitchen. They somehow got it into the water and tried to paddle toward the mainland. The currents caught them immediately. The cold water. The same water that the Army had always known would catch anyone who tried to leave. The men were pulled back toward the island, dragged in by the very bay that surrounded them, and returned to the prison. Returned to punishment. But here is the thing that matters about that story. Those 4 men were not career criminals. They were not hardened lawbreakers who had spent their lives in and out of institutions. They were young men, American young men, who had reached a point of desperation so complete, a point where the conditions of their confinement had become so unbearable that a butter vat in 53-degree water in San Francisco Bay in the dark of night looked like a reasonable option. That is what Alcatraz in 1900 did to people. It took them to the edge of the absolutely rational and pushed them over it. By the turn of the century, there were people outside the island who were beginning to ask questions. Reform advocates, progressive journalists, a small number of politicians who had begun to hear whispers about what was happening on the rock in the bay. The early 1900s were a period of genuine social reform momentum in America. The progressive era was gaining force, and there was a growing public consciousness about the treatment of prisoners, about the purpose of incarceration, about whether punishment alone accomplished anything other than producing more damaged human beings. And some of those reformers turned their attention to Alcatraz. What they found, or what they were able to find, given the military's fierce control over access to the island, troubled them deeply. A pamphlet written by Philip Grosser, a conscientious objector who was imprisoned at Alcatraz during World War I, described the island as Uncle Sam's Devil's Island, a comparison to the notorious French penal colony in French Guiana that was internationally recognized as one of the most inhumane places of confinement in the world. That comparison was not made lightly, and it was not made without evidence. But the military had one enormous advantage over its critics. It controlled the information. Access to Alcatraz required prior written approval from the commanding officer. Journalists couldn't just show up. Reform groups couldn't walk through. The island was its own world, sealed off from scrutiny, and everything that happened there happened in a fog as thick and impenetrable as the one that rolled in off the bay every morning. By 1907, the Army officially redesignated Alcatraz as the Pacific branch of the United States military prison, a formal acknowledgement that the island's primary function was now incarceration rather than defense. The fortress was being phased out. The prison was the future. And so they started building. Military prisoners, the same men who were serving time on the island, were put to work constructing a new cell house. You read that correctly. The men imprisoned at Alcatraz built the prison that would hold them and the men who came after them. They broke rock from the island's own stone. They hauled concrete. They worked in the cold bay wind. And slowly, from 1909 to 1912, a massive new structure rose on the island. What would become, when it was completed in 1912, one of the largest reinforced concrete buildings in the entire United States. 500 feet long. For cell blocks. 600 individual cells. A building designed to confine human beings with a thoroughness and permanence that the old citadel had never quite achieved. It was, in the grim language of institutional architecture, an impressive achievement. The men who built it with their own hands would have used different words. Now let us return to Thomas. Because Thomas did not escape on a butter vat. Thomas did not make any dramatic gesture of rebellion that history recorded. Thomas did what most men at Alcatraz did in 1900. He endured. He got up in the morning when the bell rang. He put on the cast-off military uniform that had been dyed a non-regulation color, the one with his number stamped on it, the one with no military buttons or insignia, because the Army had decided that a convicted soldier had forfeited the right to those. He went to work. He broke rocks. He hauled materials. He sat through meals in silence, not allowed to speak to the man next to him. And he ate what he was given, and he went back to his cell, and he lay on his cot, and he listened to the bay outside the walls. On the nights when the fever came, and it did come, because this was Alcatraz in 1900 and illness was as constant a presence as the guards and the cold. He lay in the dark and tried to remember what Ohio looked like in the summer. The color of the fields. The sound of his mother's voice. The gap-toothed laugh that she said could fill a whole room. He held on to those things the way a drowning man holds on to anything that keeps him from going under. Whether it was enough, whether Thomas made it off that island with enough of himself intact to rebuild something on the other side, is a question history cannot fully answer. Because history rarely preserved the names of the ordinary men, the ones who were not famous, the ones who did not attempt a daring escape or lead a rebellion. The ones who simply suffered and endured and disappeared back into the fabric of the country when it was finally over, carrying their damage quietly, the way men of that generation were expected to carry everything. The broader truth of Alcatraz in 1900, The truth that gives this whole story its weight and its darkness is that what happened on that island was the product of a system operating exactly as designed. This was not a prison gone wrong. This was a prison that was doing precisely what it was built to do. The U.S. Army had created an institution specifically designed to use geography, isolation, cold, labor, silence, and the constant threat of further punishment to break the will of the men confined there. The calculation, made explicitly in military regulations, was that a man who was sufficiently broken, sufficiently stripped of agency and autonomy and dignity, would emerge from the experience willing to conform, willing to follow orders, willing to be, in the language of the institution, a proper soldier. What the architects of that system either didn't understand or chose not to acknowledge was that the breaking was permanent, that you couldn't take a human being apart with cold and starvation and isolation and silence, and then simply put him back together and send him out into the world as if nothing had happened. The men who left Alcatraz in that era didn't leave whole. They left carrying something that had no name in 1900, something that we would recognize today with much more precise clinical language: post-traumatic stress, psychological damage from prolonged isolation, the long-term cognitive effects of malnutrition and chronic illness. They walked off that island into a country that had no framework for understanding what had been done to them and no particular interest in finding out. By 1913, just over a decade after the population had exploded to over 400 men, a remarkable thing happened. The Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, a Major General named Enoch Crowder, formally concluded that Alcatraz was most objectionable as a prison site. He argued that the island's prominence in San Francisco Bay was itself a problem, that having a military prison so visibly located in a major harbor was unfair advertising of Army discipline, a public relations liability for the military. His solution was to eventually close the military prison and relocate it. It took 2 more decades for that to actually happen. The military used Alcatraz until 1933, when the island was transferred to the Department of Justice and reborn as the federal penitentiary that most Americans know from history books and movies. But in the gap between 1900 and 1933, thousands of men passed through that island. Soldiers, conscientious objectors, war veterans, men who had served America and been broken by it. And almost none of their names survived in the way that history preserves names, as known things, as remembered things, as people who mattered to the larger story being told. Here is the final thing I want you to sit with. Today, Alcatraz Island receives approximately 1.5 million visitors every year. They take the ferry from Fisherman's Wharf. They walk through the Cellhouse. They stand in the individual cells, 9 feet by 5 feet, barely enough space to lie down and stretch out. And they take photographs, and they buy souvenirs in the gift shop, and they ride back to San Francisco with the wind in their faces and the city glittering ahead of them. And most of those visitors, most of those 1.5 million people, are thinking about Al Capone and the 1962 escape and the Clint Eastwood movie. They are thinking about the famous criminals and the dramatic jailbreaks and the mythology of the Rock. What they are almost certainly not thinking about is Thomas. They are not thinking about the 441 men who arrived in the spring of 1900, sick from the Philippines, chained and numbered and stripped of their insignia. They are not thinking about the dungeons beneath the main building, the cold stone rooms below ground where men were put in the dark and left there. They are not thinking about what it sounded like at night on that island in 1900. The bay against the walls, the wind in the corridors, the profound and terrible silence that the army had mandated and enforced and called, with a straight face, discipline. They are not thinking about what was built on that island long before the famous criminals arrived. And the question I want to leave you with, the question I genuinely hope you'll carry with you after this video ends, is a simple one. When a country sends its own soldiers into conditions designed to break them, and then writes that process into regulations and calls it policy, and seals it away from the public behind military access restrictions and decades of more famous history, what do we owe the people who were broken? What do we owe Thomas? And does the fact that we built a gift shop on top of it mean that we have answered that question? Or does it mean that we have simply found a more comfortable way to avoid it? That is the story of Alcatraz in 1900. Not the legend. The truth. The cold, documented, historically sourced truth of what that island was and what it did to the men who were sent there. If this story moved you, and I genuinely hope it did. The most powerful thing you can do right now is leave a comment below. Tell us what you think. Tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. And if you're watching from somewhere around the country or around the world, we want to know that too. Drop your location in the comments. We read every single one. This channel exists to tell the stories that don't always make it into the textbooks. The human stories. The ones that happened to real people with real names and real families and real lives before history swallowed them whole. If that's the kind of storytelling you want more of, hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss what we put out next. Because the next story we're going to tell you, it is going to take everything you thought you knew about American justice and turn it completely upside down.